interventions that are being performed on children as young as 12 years old. And so Do No Harm has created an amazing database, the first of its kind, and it's called Stop the Harm Database. And you can actually go onto the database by state and see which hospitals are performing this medical abuse on our children.
And January, go back for a little bit to me. You mentioned the fact that your daughter had been socially transitioned. Explain what that means to people.
Sure. Oftentimes it's seen as, it's just the name and pronouns. What is the harm? Well, the harm is you are affirming in a child's mind, a very impressionable child. Many of these children have co-occurring mental health issues like previous sexual trauma, eating disorders, self-harm, and up to 40% of these children are on the autism spectrum. So when the schools are performing these psychosocial interventions, this is not a benign intervention. You can go on to a website called Gender Spectrum and actually see these transition plans firsthand. The one that they did with my daughter was a 6-page plan that they completed behind closed doors with 3 adults. There was the assistant principal, the guidance counselor, and a social worker we had never met that sat down alone in a room with my 13-year-old daughter. And they asked her questions way beyond name and pronouns. They asked these children which restroom and locker room they prefer to use. Obviously, this is a safety issue. And then they asked my daughter, which sex do you prefer to room with on overnight field trips? The last thing that they do, which is incredibly egregious toward parents, is they ask the child, how should we refer to you when speaking to your parents? Should we use your birth name and pronouns or your quote unquote preferred name and pronouns? And this is to effectively deceive parents that these social transition plans are even occurring in the schools. And it even goes so far as to train the guidance counselors and the teachers performing these psychosocial interventions, which they are grossly unqualified to do, to hide these gender support plans, is their official name, so that they don't go in the students' accumulative file. So we have parents who were completely in the dark that their child was struggling over distress over their sex, that everybody in the school, from the cafeteria worker to the teacher to the students, were aware that this child was struggling with a psychiatric issue, except for the people that know and love this child the most. And in fact, shortly after we went public with what happened to our family, there was another child in Clay County in Florida. You can look this up. A 12-year-old girl attempted suicide on school campus. And that child had been meeting for months with a guidance counselor. That guidance counselor convinced her that she was born in the wrong body, that all of her issues were related to gender, and the parents had no idea that the child was even meeting with the guidance counselor.
And how did you find out about the situation with your daughter?
Thankfully, my daughter had come to us in the spring of 2020. So when she started school that fall, I know my daughter very well. I can tell the kind of day she's had just the way she walks to the car. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I am very involved in my children's life. And my daughter got into the car and told me, she said, Mom, we had a meeting today about my name because I knew that she was wanting to go by a different name. I naively thought it would be treated as a nickname. There was so much that we didn't know in 2020 about this issue. Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, had just come out. So it was really at the infancy of parents understanding what is gender ideology. Why are we seeing all of these children suddenly believing they are born in the wrong body? But my daughter was actually the one that told me, because she thought it was weird that they asked her which restroom she wanted to use. She was so confused. And at the heart of this, these kids are simply confused. No child is born in the wrong body. So, your listeners can certainly Google my name and hear longer versions of my story. But when I initially reached out to the school and said, I want to know about this meeting you had with my daughter. Why are you asking her which restroom she wanted to use? Because at the time she was identifying as non-binary. Her quote unquote gender identity changed 4 times in 2 years. But I reached out to the school immediately, and I was told by the guidance counselor and the assistant principal they could not give me any information about the private meeting they had with my daughter because she was protected by a non-discrimination law. This was a lie. There is no law that affords privacy from parents.
Well, and like I said, we spoke a little bit off the air here in New Mexico. We passed a law 2 years ago in the legislature that essentially, I think that a public official, and that would include school teachers, if they disclose information, they can actually be fined for that sort of thing. And so that's pretty disturbing that your child can be going through what is I think a mental health crisis, and you're not even going to be informed. You may not know anything about it until that child has already been basically indoctrinated. It would be my view of it with this radical gender ideology.
Well, that's exactly right, Steve. And this is an attack on the nuclear family. What the schools are doing is really parental alienation. And in any other circumstance, this would be completely illegal and unethical. When they interfere in the parent-child relationship in this manner, they send a very clear message to the child that the parent's input is no longer needed or wanted, that the child actually needs to be protected from parents, not by parents.
Right.
And this creates a huge wedge in the parent-child relationship, as I know very well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the fact that when your daughter went through this, there were other girls that had also done this. And I've read Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, and, rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it seems it's more with girls than it is boys. I know originally, gender dysphoria was almost exclusively with boys, and it was a very, very tiny minority. But this recent surge in this, and I mean, it's a surge in the number of people identifying as, either non-binary or, there's so many different genders now. It's ridiculous. But that has surged, but and I believe I'm correct on this. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it's the vast majority of it is with girls now.
That's correct. And, unfortunately, we are seeing boys. And there's a whole website, rogdboys.com, that's devoted to just the boys, because these are the most vulnerable children falling prey to this. These are kids that don't fit in. They are looking for acceptance. And there's a reason why it's mostly girls, and it's the way that they socially interact.
Right.
Historically, they have been vulnerable to all kinds of social contagions. In the late 90s, we saw eating disorders. We've seen social contagions of self-harm. And then, of course, it's a perfect storm where we have culture, social media, normalizing this issue, normalizing using breast binders as if it's just another form of a bra, normalizing girls getting double mastectomies, calling it, a civil rights issue, a human rights issue. But the human rights issue, Steve, is that children have a right to go through natural puberty. That, in fact, is what helps most of these children to overcome their distress. Puberty is not a disease to be avoided. There is no wrong puberty. And this entire ideology is built on a lie of gender identity. Yet your state and many others are codifying this theory into our laws, yet it can't even be clearly quantified or defined.
Right. And it's just when I look at this, and the thing that I see, and I had a young lady that is detransitioning on a while back, and I've heard from Chloe Cole. I've listened to some of her interviews and things, and it's just the whole idea of taking somebody who is having a mental health crisis and taking their healthy body and destroying it. When we say gender affirming care, of course, the first thing generally is the social transitioning, but then when you start getting into the actual puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then the surgeries. And I just think that's malpractice. I mean, actually, I don't think they should do that on adults either, but certainly not for children, because they really can't consent to these things. And, that's why I'm glad to see this database here where people can go on and see, because I think people don't even believe this is happening, because it is. It's almost hard to believe that people can do this to children, but it is happening.
Well, and for many years, they claimed it wasn't happening, Steve. And, when I pulled back the curtain, because I needed to understand not only what was happening with my child, but where was this going to lead her? And you're exactly right. One of the reasons why it's so egregious that schools are performing these social transitions without parent notification or consent is because it is the first step toward medical transition. And as I was experiencing this with my daughter as a mental health professional, I noticed so many similarities between the distress and the self-hate she was experiencing for her body and clients that I had worked with eating disorders. There are a lot of similarities. And I personally believe the whole idea of having a separate diagnosis called gender dysphoria, it was a political decision, not any decision based on evidence. This could have all been under the diagnosis of body dysmorphia. It's no different, but that's a conversation for another time. But you're exactly right. Children do not have the ability, the cognitive ability, to consent to these irreversible medical interventions. And we know this from decades of brain development. So why this has gotten as far as it has is so beyond my understanding. And it's so horrific when you really start to peel the layers away from what is, quote unquote, gender affirming care. This is not healthcare. This is medically sanctioned self-harm. They are putting the scalpel in the hands of these children, and they try to claim it's not happening, and this database proves beyond a reasonable doubt that it is. In fact, it covered that there are 5,747 children between the ages of 0 and 17 and a half that have undergone some form of sex change surgeries. So they can no longer claim this isn't happening. 8,579 children received cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers. And the total charges submitted is close to $120 million. And you can go on to stoptheharmdatabase.com and look at New Mexico's stats. We've got 119 total sex change children patients, 41 surgeries, and almost $354,000 worth of charges submitted for these interventions.
Right. And I believe this, and this is just based on information that they got from insurance filings. And so there could be many more than this. This is just Absolutely. Kind of the tip of the iceberg.
That's correct. We were very conservative in our data. Michelle Habrilla and Beth Serio with Do No Harm did an amazing job putting this together, but they analyzed publicly available insurance claims. It did not include Kaiser Permanente and a couple of other, entities that we did not have access to their data. And it also did not include parents who have paid out of pocket. But, they like to pretend this isn't happening because it's so horrific. But we saw this on national television. Jazz Jennings was surgically castrated at the age of 17. And if you have followed his story, it is such a tragic story. This was a gender nonconforming little boy who liked to wear tutus and liked the color pink. And because of that, his parents were falsely told that he was in fact not a little boy, that he was a little girl based on archaic sex stereotypes.
Right. It's just it's great. I've heard some people say too. It's and even some people in the homosexual community, that they call it transing away the gay. And you're taking kids that may have, sexual orientation towards homosexuality, and you're basically, then you're going to change their sex. And it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, you're taking a perfectly healthy body and destroying it because you have maybe an unhealthy mind. And that just doesn't make any sense. Well, I played a clip the other day from a young lady, and I can't remember what her name was, but she basically said that she's an adult now, but she had the so-called top surgery, which is a double mastectomy. And, you can't go back from these things. There's the doctor out in California. I'm reluctant to call her a doctor, but a person that performs these. And she says, well, if you want breasts, you can always go back and get them. It's like, well, no, that's not the same thing. And it's just hideous.
That's Dr. Johanna Olson Kennedy. She is one of the worst egregious doctors when it comes to this, because she even compared it to a diabetes patient. With diabetes, you're trying to cure a disease. They are actually taking the healthy bodies of these children and putting them into a disease state. We don't have any kind of measure to say, oh, yes, this person is 100% born in the wrong body. Think about that. When you actually start to think about what they're doing to children, and you look at the evidence being used to justify these irreversible medical interventions, you see that this entire scandal is built on quicksand. It's, first of all, you just hit on one of the biggest lies. You can't change someone's sex.
Right.
Regardless of what physical alterations you make to someone's body, sex cannot be changed. It is binary. And so these interventions are not based in evidence, which is why the U.S. is now an outlier in how we are especially treating children. Now, with adults, you have to understand that there is still no safeguarding. Any person over the age of 18, and in some states it's younger, can go into Planned Parenthood and get testosterone or estrogen on their first visit. There is zero safeguarding. Plastic surgeons, many of these quote-unquote gender plastic surgeons, like the one down in Miami, Dr. Gallagher, they are simply a menu of services that people can choose from. There is no safeguarding when it comes to this area of medicine. And there's also no consensus, by the way. Activists love to say, well, they all support this. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the AMA, the APA. Well, right now, the American Academy of Pediatrics is being sued by a detransitioner. So there are many more lawsuits that I think are going to help to bring down this Goliath, but there is not consensus. That is a lie. And in fact, Dr. Stephen Williams, the former president of the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, came out very strongly and very clearly in the last few months that the evidence does not support doing these interventions on children. That's exactly what the Cass review found. Dr. Hilary Cass, a very respected pediatrician in the UK, did a 4-year systematic review. And that is something that only Florida has done. The American Academy of Pediatrics said they were going to do a systematic review, which they still haven't done. And the Endocrine Society also has not done. So we have these medical institutions that have been infiltrated with ideology over evidence, because there is no good evidence to be doing this, especially to children.
Absolutely. And I was going to mention the Cass report, and most of the European countries, I know several have, France, I believe Finland, there's at least 5 or so that have come out and said, there's really no evidence that these interventions do any positive, that have any positive good for the children that they're doing them on, and they're backing off of them. And as you mentioned, we are the outlier here. And
that's right. And especially when you look at the evidence, Steve, just like my daughter, the vast majority of these kids will resolve their distress once they go through puberty and their brains have a chance to fully develop, because they all come to the same conclusion. This was a lie.
Right.
You cannot change sex. And isn't it more compassionate to help someone become comfortable in their natal body instead of affirming that something's wrong with their body? What a horrible message to send to young children. And what the school did in particular with my daughter is they celebrated her. And what they were really doing was celebrating her self-hate. This ideology and we are about to see a wave of detransitioners who were medically transitioned and are going to come to
Okay, I think January, I think we're having a little bit of trouble with our connection here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I lost you a little bit there at the end. All right, well, we're about out of time. If a parent has a situation where they think their child might be, this might be a situation that their child is involved in, what would you recommend to them as we close out here?
Well, we put together a parent resource page for exactly those parents and just let them know that they're not alone. You can go to donoharmmedicine.org and look for a resource page. They can reach out to me directly through filling out a contact information page, like an inquiry. But parents have got to understand that this ideology has infected every ounce of our culture, and they need to be actively inoculating their children from this ideology from a very young age so that when children are exposed to the lies, they know this is all a lie.
All right. Well, January, we appreciate you being on, and I think I think you're right. I think the lawsuits are probably going to be the thing that really turns the tide on this and puts a stop to it. But I think this is the greatest medical hoax of our time, for sure.
It absolutely is. Thank you so much for having me on, Steve.
All right. Have a great day. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. That is January Littlejohn, and she is she was with Do No Harm, and I forgot to, push up my thing there, so you probably may not have heard it quite as well as I want to. I'll probably play this again tomorrow on our Keeping You Informed, because I do think this is an important issue. And here in New Mexico, 2 years ago in our legislative session, we absolutely bought in on this stuff. And it needs to be reversed. And you need to be calling your state legislator and saying, hey, what are you doing about, and I'll get you the numbers on the laws, but those laws need to be amended or completely reversed, so that they don't include, this protection for so-called gender affirming care. It's a malpractice, and it is a great medical hoax, and we need to put a stop to that in the state. That's an absolute thing we must do. This is, I think some people are well-meaning. They think they're doing good, but this is harmful.